on our website. It will take us some time to get that up on the website, but when we have the link available, we'll make sure to send it out to everyone so that you'll be able to access it and share that recording with others who maybe couldn't join us today. In order to ask questions today, because we do have about 100 people on the line and it gets a little bit unwieldy to try to do that orally over the phone, so we're going to use the questions pane, or it might be called the chat pane that's on your control panel there on the side. That's where you are typing your questions and your comments in. So go ahead and just type any questions that you have into that control panel. We won't answer them exactly right when you type them in, but we will break for questions a little bit later, and we'll have the opportunity to look at questions that you've typed into the control panel and answer those out loud on the call. So as you go through, you can just go ahead and answer questions as you have them, and we will get to them when we take our question break a little bit later in the call. For people who might be having a little bit of trouble with sound, I see some people, one person says that the sound is turned up and it's a little bit hard to hear. We are using a microphone system, so the sound is as clear as we can get it. It may be a problem with the volume on your computer or the speaker on your computer, so that might be an issue. But I see that some people are hearing fine, so hopefully we'll be able to continue and not have too many technical difficulties. So thanks for letting us know how that volume is working for you. It's hard to know when we're all far away. Volume problems may be something that you might want to ask someone in your office who knows about the computer speakers to help you with. Okay, so now that we've gotten some of our housekeeping out of the way, we will have a guest speaker joining us just a little bit later in the webinar. I'm going to allow her to introduce herself when she starts speaking a little bit later. But just to give you a little heads up, her name is Amy Laudit. She is with the National Network for Youth and has a wealth of experience working with youth experiencing homelessness in California. So I'm very excited to have Amy with us today. What we will be talking about today, of course, is AB 652, but to give you a little bit of context, many of you probably are aware that 2013 and 2014 were record years for homeless youth legislation in the state of California. In fact, in the year 2013, there were more bills passed in Sacramento related to homeless youth than in any year in the history of the California state legislature. So it was a big year for homeless youth legislation in 2013. That continued into 2014, and we're expecting the same coming up this year. There's been a lot of work done by organizations around the state to raise awareness about youth homelessness. Members of the state legislature are really paying attention to the issue more so than probably ever before. And it's really nice to see some new state policies and legislation coming out to help children and youth and families who are experiencing homelessness. So in 2014, we had a couple of different bills passed. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list, but just some things to let you know about. Just last year, we had AB 1733 pass. AB 1733 provides free ID cards and birth certificates for people who are homeless in the state of California. That law hasn't quite gone into effect yet because the different departments involved have to put together some regulations so that it can be implemented appropriately. But later on this year, that law will go into effect, and hopefully that will eliminate barriers to getting birth certificates and ID cards for many of the children and youth that you all might be working with. Also in 2014, AB 1806 passed. Those of you who will work in school districts are probably familiar with this. There's been a similar program in place for foster youth for many years, and this is designed to help increase graduation rates for youth experiencing homelessness so that if they change schools after they complete their first 2 years of high school, if they change school districts, and the new school district might have some different graduation requirements, so they might be very well on track to graduation in one district, their homelessness forces them to move to another district, and they might all of a sudden find themselves behind because of different requirements. This bill would work to help limit the impact of that on youth experiencing homelessness. There have been a lot of questions on implementation of this bill, and we will be having a webinar in May with some expert speakers to help us with specific strategies and tips on how to implement this effectively for youth experiencing homelessness. So you might want to mark that one on your calendars. I will mention you don't have to worry about scribbling down this very long and confusing link that's on your slide there. Just about an hour after we finish our training today, you'll automatically get an email that will include a link so that you can download this PowerPoint. And then instead of having to try to write it down with a pen, you can just click on it. 2013 state legislation, again, as I said, it was a record year for state legislation related to youth homelessness in 2013. There's AB 346, which has to do with youth shelter licensing. The California Coalition for Youth was really the driving force behind that bill, and they continue to work on implementation of that. So if you have any questions on that one, I would definitely recommend you contact the California Coalition for Youth. They're located in Sacramento, although they are a statewide organization. AB 1006 related to sealing of juvenile court records to hopefully eliminate barriers to future employment and housing that can be caused by juvenile records. AB 309 was designed to help eliminate barriers to CalFresh or SNAP access for youth who are homeless, particularly youth on their own. We've had really, really widespread reports of that bill being very effective and of county welfare offices doing a great job to implement that and eliminate those barriers. So if you have questions or comments on that, feel free to contact me later. SB 177 was called the Homeless Youth Education Success Act. We had a webinar about that back in December. That webinar was recorded. We will get that up on our website as soon as we can, so you can get some information. But essentially, SB 177 eliminated residency barriers for youth experiencing homelessness in participating in sports and extracurricular activities. It bolstered the requirements that already exist in the McKinney-Vento Act for immediate enrollment and public notice. And it also convened a work group between the California Department of Education and Department of Social Services to look at DSS policies and education policies as they relate to unaccompanied youth and how those agencies can work together with other agencies to eliminate barriers to youth receiving services. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in our webinar. For those of you, there are still a couple of people commenting in the chat box that they're having some problem with sound, but I know that other people are getting sound, so I don't think it's an issue on our end. Someone suggested logging off and then logging back in. I think that might be a good idea. You all should have received that link to log in. It might just be an issue of logging off and logging back in again. I apologize for those problems, but I think it's a problem on the computers of the people who are having the issue. Getting back to the slide, AB 1068 is the last bill that we just wanted to mention for you. We will be having a webinar on AB 1068 in March, so that again might be another one you might want to put on your calendar. AB 1068 has to do with pupil records, and again, those of you in schools are familiar with FERPA. Essentially, AB 1068 looks at the rights of unaccompanied youth to consent to disclose their own educational records and to access their own educational records. It's really building on guidance that came out from the Federal Department of Education, and also trying to protect the privacy of the homeless status of children and youth experiencing homelessness. So again, in March, we'll have some more information from that on you. Or on that for you. So now let's get into AB 652, which is what we're here to talk about today. AB 652 deals with unaccompanied homeless youth and Child Protective Services reporting, or I'll just use the acronym CPS reporting. Now, before we get too deep into this, let's make sure we know what we're talking about when we say unaccompanied youth. We are looking at the definition of unaccompanied youth that comes from the education subtitle of the McKinney-Vento Act. So again, those of you who are in schools are going to be very familiar with this. If you work for another agency, we are talking about the education definition of homelessness. So that includes children and youth who are sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason, as well as those who might be in shelters or transitional living programs, living in a public space, cars, parks, motels, etc. So unaccompanied youth in the McKinney-Vento Act refers to youth who are experiencing homelessness based on that definition I just mentioned, and youth who are not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So we really have two criteria there, meeting the definition of homelessness and also not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. Now, here's what AB 652 says. I wanted to give you the exact word for word language of the bill so that we're not paraphrasing or confusing anything. And we'll go into this kind of step by step to make sure that it all makes sense. But you can see on the slide the fact that a child is homeless or is classified as an unaccompanied minor, as defined in the education subtitle McKinney-Vento that I just mentioned, is not in and of itself a sufficient basis for reporting child abuse or neglect. And again, we're going to get into this in a little more detail. Then you'll see the second paragraph that says nothing in this section shall limit a mandated reporter from making a report whenever that mandated reporter has knowledge of or observes an unaccompanied minor whom the mandated reporter knows or reasonably suspects to be the victim of abuse or neglect. So basically, as you read this, it might sound like the first paragraph and the second paragraph are a little in conflict, but the idea here is that being an unaccompanied homeless youth, an unaccompanied minor, is not a basis for reporting to child abuse or neglect of itself. That in and of itself is not considered abuse or neglect. So if a mandated reporter has other additional information above and beyond just knowing that the youth is an unaccompanied homeless youth, that additional information may trigger a report to CPS, and that's going to be based on the requirements for reporting that I suspect you're all aware of. Hopefully you've gotten training of what triggers a report and what does not. But the key is just knowing that a youth is an unaccompanied homeless youth. That's not going to meet the definition of neglect under California state law. Now, let's get into a little more detail here because this can be confusing, and we want to also provide some background about why is this even an issue and why is there even a law about this. So let's talk a little bit about some of the realities of unaccompanied youth. We talked about the definition, but really, who are these youth? We know that many youth become homeless with their families, but then become separated and are on their own due to lack of space in temporary accommodations. So, for example, there might be a neighbor or someone from church or a family member who says they have space to take 2 or 3 people to stay with them, but a family of 5 or 6, they just can't take the whole family. So oftentimes, particularly the older youth, will be sent to stay somewhere else, maybe even staying outside or camping or in a car or going from couch to couch because there's just not enough space in that temporary accommodation. There also sometimes are shelter policies that can prohibit adolescent boys from staying with their families. Now, there is federal housing policy called the Hearth Act that actually makes those shelter policies illegal or not allowed for shelter programs that get federal homeless housing and urban development funds. So if you have any questions about that, I don't want to get off onto that tangent, but feel free to contact me with questions about that one. We also know that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth are overrepresented in the homeless youth population. So there are many young people who are forced out of their homes when they reveal their sexual orientation to their parents. And we also know that many youth are forced out of their homes after revealing pregnancy to their parents. So studies show that 1 in 10 currently homeless female teenagers are pregnant and have been asked to leave their homes by their parents who are unhappy about that pregnancy. We also know that, again, there are disproportionate rates of sexual abuse and physical abuse among unaccompanied homeless youth. So depending on the study, studies have found 20 to 50% of unaccompanied youth experienced sexual abuse in their homes, 40 to 60% were physically abused. And there are high rates of what I call family dysfunction. So, for example, over 2/3 of callers to the National Runaway Hotline said that at least one of their parents abuses drugs or alcohol. So oftentimes there are illegal activities happening in the home, whether that's drug use, whether that's prostitution, or unhealthy alcohol use that creates an environment where youth leave their homes. So let's pause a minute for a poll. We have a lot of experts on the phone with us today, about 110 of you. And so I would like to know about your experience with this issue of unaccompanied youth and reporting to CPS. Why do we have this law, this AB 652? And I'd like to have you answer with your own experience about whether or not fear of being reported to CPS can scare youth away from seeking services or from asking for the help that they need. So you should see that poll up on your screen now. Go ahead and click yes or no. Take your time. I can see how many people have voted. So when we get to the point where most people have voted, I will close the polls and we'll see what the results are. Looks like most people have voted, so we'll give you just a few more seconds to get your vote in if you have not done so yet, and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay, closing the poll. Now we'll go ahead and share the poll results. So hopefully you're seeing that on your screen. 80% of you said that you have seen that fear of being reported to CPS can scare youth away from seeking services or asking for help. And that's really where the logic behind AB 652 came from, is trying to find a balance between reporting that makes sense and that needs to be done so that youth can be safe and get services, but also recognizing that a lot of youth aren't even going to ask for help, and they might remain in very dangerous or very unhealthy situations because of that fear. So thank you very much for participating in that poll with us. We're going to go back to our screen. Hopefully you all are actually seeing your screen now, if I did this right. So AB 652, like I said, the logic behind it is basically what we just saw in our poll, and your results in that poll are right in line with studies that have been done in different parts of the country around fear of CPS reporting being a barrier to youth seeking services. So my organization, NAEHCY, has done surveys of unaccompanied youth in several cities around the country. For youth under 18, that fear of reporting is always the number one barrier and the number one reason that youth cite for not asking for help. In the state of California, there's an organization called the California Council of Youth Relations. Sorry about that. They have a really great housing advisory group of young people, and they've actually put together a letter that we were able to use in some of our advocacy about how CPS reporting creates a barrier to youth seeking services. And then in Massachusetts, the Appleseed Center for Law and Justice did a poll of service providers. And again, very similar to the results that we just saw here, 85% agreed that fear of being reported prevents youth from coming forward and seeking services. So the flip side of these barriers is what we see when we look at what happens when a report is made. So if we look at the child welfare outcomes, and this is data from the state of California, if we look at about 90,000 reports to CPS, and these are just reports coming from educators, and these are not reports just of unaccompanied homeless youth, obviously. These are all reports, CPS reports coming in from educators. Out of 90,000, only 15% were substantiated and actually resulted in services to the child, youth, or family that was referred. We also know that many, particularly older youth who are involved in the foster care system, they experience homelessness even after they get out of foster care. There's a very high correlation of aging out of foster care and then experiencing homelessness as a young adult, 18 to 24. And some of the outcomes of child welfare really aren't what we would hope. And I think these are particularly pronounced, again, when we're talking about teenagers, older youth, where the structure of that system and even kind of the philosophy of it really is very difficult to be successful with that particular population of youth. So that whole conversation gets us back to AB 652 again, and the language of the law that we saw a little bit earlier. Again, that just being an unaccompanied minor does not require a report to CPS, and that there really needs to be some additional knowledge of additional levels of danger and really current activity that's going on right now that triggers that mandated reporter to say there's some abuse going on right now above and beyond the fact that the child is an unaccompanied minor, and that's going to trigger a report. So being an unaccompanied youth does not on its own equal neglect or abuse. This actually allows us to give youth some self-determination, where they can make some choices about what information they share and what information they don't share. And we can make some choices about what questions we ask and what questions we don't ask. Again, not at all trying to encourage people to avoid their requirements for mandated reporting. People are mandated reporters. They have to live up to those requirements. But we do need to make sure that we are eliminating barriers to youth receiving services. And so we need to think about how do we manage that situation. And to talk to us about how we manage that situation, we have our guest speaker, Amy Laudit. And Amy, I am going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself because you have such a wealth of experience. And I know that if I try to introduce you, I'm going to forget some things. So if you wouldn't mind letting the folks know a little bit about who you are and what brings you to this topic, and then give us some tips, some implementation strategies about how we can work effectively with unaccompanied homeless youth, thinking about their safety, but also thinking about their self-determination and about the fact that the fear of reporting really is keeping youth in unsafe situations.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Loudit. I started working with homeless youth back in 2007. And while I don't necessarily work directly with youth anymore, I still keep in contact with a lot of my old students. That once that trust is built, it's hard for them to find another stable adult that they can trust with their issues as they become young adults themselves. And so part of what I want to talk about is the practical strategies as far as building that relationship and that trust and being able to get to that point where they can voluntarily reveal to you whether, on their own time, whether a report actually needs to be made or not. As you'll see on your screen, I'd like to start out by telling people, especially liaisons and mentors, that letting the youth know that your office or where you meet them is a safe place for confidentiality. This can be done either by having a conversation, explaining what confidentiality means in layman's terms, just kind of, saying it in a way that they can hear and understand is really important. I have had colleagues that have made posters for their offices saying safe place for confidentiality, and then using that poster as a jumping off point for the conversation. I personally never had a poster in my office, but the first time meeting with a student, that would be the first piece of the conversation that we would have. Part of that poster or that conversation should be giving the youth fair warning so that they can choose what they want to reveal to you, letting them know, if you tell me that you are being abused by the person that you're staying with, I have to make a report. There's nothing against telling them these are the things that you can tell me that I will have to report to CPS. That kind of puts the ball in their court, which helps them trust you. So once that conversation has begun and you start asking questions about what services they need, I feel is a really good way to get that conversation past the confidentiality part. Using active listening is really important when building these relationships with youth. Being able to not just, how do I put this? Not just nodding your head, but asking open-ended questions in response to things that they may have said, but not pushing the issue. So there's a fine line, it's a balance, and I think that really just comes with experience and kind of testing it out. And if you're new to this game, you can definitely put that out there for the youth. Them hearing that you're not perfect, I think also really helps them to open up because they're not perfect either. And a lot of times they look at adults as, on these pedestals. And so how could they possibly ever relate to me if they're so perfect? This is kind of it might seem kind of strange, but if possible, not putting furniture between you and the youth. So having your chair to the side of your desk as opposed to the opposite side of your desk really helps open up the body language and helps them feel more connected, not so disassociated from you. It is okay to embrace moments of silence. So if you're using those open-ended questions and that active listening and the youth just kind of shuts down for a minute, that's okay. Because it takes the average brain 22 seconds to interpret a new question or something that hasn't ever really been put before them before. And so allowing that silence to go is totally fine. A lot of my youth have, I would ask them a question about their living situation, and it takes them a second to really kind of formulate how they want to, how much they want to reveal to you, and how to word that. And if you interrupt that silent moment, it starts to feel pushy, which we don't want to do. So in those moments, letting it settle and waiting is important. And then once they answer, you really, under AB 652, get to use your own best judgment about how to interpret what they've said. They may tell you that they're staying with their boyfriend, but they didn't tell you how old the boyfriend is. But then later on in the conversation, it might come up that quote-unquote boyfriend is 30 years old. Clearly, there's something else going on there. And so you may want to at a later time ask follow-up questions about that. But really, you have to feel it out. If it doesn't feel like they're going to want to open up that piece of the conversation to you, you may not want to ask those questions. And that's solely based on building that trust relationship more than trying to avoid a CPS report. My number one goal is always building that rapport with the youth. And I've found that eventually, it may take hours, but it may take months. And that's okay. You have to meet the youth where they're at and allow them to kind of navigate this relationship. And then, finally being open and available, letting them know that your office door is always open to them. And if you're not there, giving them a way to contact you is killer. It really, really helps foster that relationship for them to know that they can contact you, even if you have to say, text me, email me, contact me, any way that you need to. Drop into the office. If I'm not there, I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. I've found it goes a really long way. For example, some of my youth from Humboldt County were still contacting me while I was in law school. And it was difficult for me because I wanted to text them back immediately, but I couldn't do that because I was in class. And so at one point, I just sent out, kind of a mass message to all of my youth saying, hey, this is the situation that I'm in. You guys know that I'm always going to be here for you. Don't lose faith in me just because it takes me an hour and a half to respond. And every single one of them has been incredibly receptive to that, and really supportive, actually. It's amazing what we can learn and get out of these relationships for ourselves with these youth, as well as being able to help them through their situations. So I think I've touched every topic. Like I said before, and just to wrap it up, this whole thing is really about fostering the relationship, building that trust, and letting the youth kind of come out on their own about what's going on. Okay, Patricia, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Amy. That was so helpful, and I really appreciate that. I want to encourage people, if you have questions or follow-ups on anything that Amy just said on those strategies, please feel free to go ahead and just type those into that chat box on your screen, and I will go through and make sure that we have a chance for Amy to answer those questions or address any of those, follow-ups that you might have. One thing that really occurred to me, I think, just listening to Amy again, is how unaccompanied youth are really living a life where they're in charge, for better or worse, of what is going on with them because they don't have a parent. So even from the most basic things to, where am I going to find my dinner tonight and what am I going to eat for dinner tonight, to the most complicated questions, about relationships or future, or really unaccompanied youth are navigating all this largely on their own. And so the CPS report is something that's so out of kilter with everything else. So they're having to do everything on their own. But then this is something that kind of gets completely taken out of their hands and could potentially really alter everything about their lives. So I really appreciated, Amy, what you had to say about, you know, giving youth fair warning and giving them the information that they need so that they can be kind of making some of their own decisions about what they're going to share, what they're not going to share, and what are some of the consequences that are going to result from that. And hopefully that will create a space where they can ask for the help they need and get them out of an unsafe situation rather than them staying in an unsafe situation just because they're too afraid to come out and talk about it. So let's go on. We have just a few slides left here, and then we will be able to take a break for questions. Again, I keep getting overzealous with my clicker and jumping ahead on a slide. So a couple of additional, maybe more global or kind of district level strategies as opposed to actual dealing one-on-one with a young person strategy. Training is really important around this. I think that if people don't understand what they are and are not required to report to CPS, they could have really inaccurate information and they could be making reports that they don't need to make. And one thing that we know is that word travels fast. So if one young person is reported incorrectly to CPS, that word's going to get out, and other young people then are going to be even more afraid to talk about their situation or to ask for help. So getting the information out to folks who are working one-on-one with youth, of course, local liaisons. I know many of you on the call today are liaisons, and looking at the school staff that comes into contact with youth. So certainly counselors, teachers, others, to make sure that they're aware of what their requirements are. And at the very least that they know who to call. So if they get, if they have that talk with the youth and they're left sort of thinking, I'm not sure actually if this is something I need to report or not, that they can contact their liaison. They can, certainly contact me or Amy or others to just kind of talk it through. Leanne Wheeler from the California Department of Education, her contact information is on a later slide. Certainly a terrific resource for any questions really about homeless students, including this AB 652 question. So that's really important. I think Amy really mentioned the importance of relationships, having someone that young person knows is someone they can trust and they can talk to at the school. And it doesn't have to be, I think, a full-blown mentor program. I mean, it would be great for us to be able to have that. I know California had the M&M program for a while that was so very, very effective. But we don't need to necessarily have a full program if we are just basically giving our school staff, I think, the information they need and also the permission to have relationships. Just a quick story. My mother was a school secretary in a middle school that had a lot, the students there had a lot of challenges, very high poverty rate, lots of things going on at home for those students. And of course, her desk was outside of the principal's desk because she was the secretary. And so she would end up with a lot of kids sitting next to her waiting to get in to see the principal and just start informal conversations with them. And she really became a touchstone for a lot of those youth. They would pop into the office every single day, say, "Hey, Mrs. J." She would talk to them, and just knowing that they had somebody who was kind of looking out for them and who would realize, hey, you didn't come in yesterday. What happened to you yesterday? For unaccompanied homeless youth, oftentimes there's absolutely no one paying attention to whether they're going to school or not, except for folks in the school. And so that kind of mentorship and checking in is so important. Participation in school activities is really important, again, just because it creates an additional outlet for success for youth and also an additional format for building relationships, both with adults and with other peers. And again, I think Amy talked a lot about building trust as really being the key. Since so many of the registrants are working in school districts or school buildings, I just wanted to put in one slide kind of specifically directed towards what does this mean for schools. Hopefully this is not going to be a big change in practice. Hopefully you weren't automatically referring all of your unaccompanied homeless youth to CPS last year and now all of a sudden you're not doing that anymore. So I think for many of you in terms of practice, it might not be anything that you even really notice. We know that the McKinney-Vento Act requires immediate enrollment for homeless children and youth, even without a parent or guardian. Very often that just happens through youth enrolling themselves. There is a caregiver form, as I'm sure you know, in California that allows caregivers to enroll. So that enrollment is already in place. The issue of CPS reporting really should not be a barrier for school enrollment. And in fact, under the McKinney-Vento Act, it really can't be a barrier. If you look at that last bullet, both the state and LEAs, so that includes school districts and charter schools, must develop, review, and revise policies to remove barriers to enrollment and retention of homeless children and youth in school. And just a few slides ago, we saw that fear of CPS reporting is a significant barrier to youth requesting services and receiving services. So McKinney-Vento really requires us to remove that barrier. I think AB 62 is one way that the state of California has sought to do that. And I think in terms of just the way schools interact with youth, making sure that they know that they can come to school, that they can be involved, and that that doesn't have to be a barrier to their enrollment in school, is definitely helping to eliminate that barrier. Sometimes there are questions about, liability. What if something happens and, we didn't make a report, or what's going to be the risk of liability there? As an attorney, lawyers ask a lot of those kind of questions. And so just to give you a little bit of information, just some very, very basic information on that. I think AB 652, again, really helps to eliminate some perceived conflicts there. You've got a state law very clearly saying that being an unaccompanied homeless youth is not grounds for a CPS report. So, there's not much room for subjectivity there. You've got a nice, clear state law really providing backup on that issue. In every case, liability is always based on the concept of negligence, which legally speaking is defined as a failure to exercise reasonable care. So this kind of goes back to a lot of what Amy was talking about. If you're building trust, if you're having good conversations, if you're providing youth with information about what some of the consequences might be, and the youth is deciding what to share with you, and then you're using your judgment based on what the information that you get. Like the example that Amy gave, I'm living with my boyfriend. Well, my 18-year-old boyfriend seems like reasonable care, doesn't necessarily raise a red flag with that. My 40-year-old boyfriend, reasonable care, probably does raise a red flag with that. So I think that those of you who are working with young people probably have a pretty good sense of what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. It's important to know, and I suspect most people know this, that there is a law in the state of California that when young people or children are reported missing, law enforcement then will get in touch with schools, and there'll be a flag on the school records. So that really also helps. Obviously, if you get a child in and you look at their school records and they've got that flag on their school records, you're going to need to do something about that. Otherwise, you would not be exercising reasonable care. And another thing that some professionals do, if they get a little bit of maybe a funny feeling based on talking to the young person, there's the missingkids.com website. They also have a phone number, and you can check in there and see if the child or youth has been reported as missing or exploited. We know that actually a lot of young people who are victims of trafficking are discovered in schools. Many of them actually are still going to school. Sometimes that's the only agency that's really coming into contact with those youth. And so sometimes it is the school who's noticing something that just doesn't sit right, something that seems a little fishy, and they're able to intervene to assist that young person. Lastly, we just wanted to mention SB 177 again. I mentioned this a little bit at the outset. This is that California Department of Education and Department of Social Services work group. And you can see that the work group has some specific goals they're supposed to meet. And among those are adopting policies and practices to support homeless children and youth, and ensuring that child abuse and neglect reporting requirements do not create barriers. So this work group has not started meeting yet, but they're going to need to address these two issues. And if you have thoughts about policies and practices that you'd like to see, or ways that these two departments could come together to make sure that child abuse and neglect reporting requirements do not create barriers, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and we will bring those directly to the work group. Leanne Wheeler, who I mentioned earlier, who's the McKinney-Vento State Coordinator at CDE, is going to work to make sure that those concerns are brought to the work group. So feel free to type me an email with some of your ideas. Feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm going to pull those all together. We had some really great thoughts that were submitted in our December webinar, so we encourage you to get your ideas in, and we are going to bring those to the work group. So go ahead and either email me later or just type them into the chat box if you got an idea right now. Okay, One last issue that I wanted to do before we get to questions, and I do see that we have some questions in the chat box, so we will get to those. But related to this working group, one issue that I've been getting a lot of reports on has to do with different programs who are telling young people, particularly unaccompanied homeless youth, that in order to access this program, you have to allow us to report you to CPS. That's kind of a strange thing to say. It's not anything that's in the law. In fact, it's really going against AB 652. And I'm trying to get some information about how widespread of a problem this is. Is this just a couple of issues that I've heard because people have just brought them to my attention, or is this really something that we're seeing in different parts of the state and for different programs? So I'm going to open a quick poll on this, and I'd like to ask you to respond. You should be able to see the poll now. And the question is, have unaccompanied youth that you work with or that you've heard, have they been told they can't receive services unless they are reported to CPS? Now, you can vote multiple times on this poll. So if you've worked with a young person who went to get Medi-Cal and was told, we can't give you Medi-Cal unless you're reported to CPS, go ahead and check yes on that one. Same thing if you've been told a young person can't get CalFresh without a CPS report, you can click on that. And you can click on, all of them or any of them that you've seen or haven't seen. And I would just be interested to get a little more information about how big of a problem this is. So we'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and answer, and we'll see if this is something that's coming up or not. Okay, we'll give you just a few more seconds to indicate yes for any of these that you've seen. Okay, it looks like everyone has responded, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Share the results. Now, the results of this one, the graphs that you're seeing are probably a little bit skewed. Let me let you know that just about 40 of you voted that, yes, you have seen these barriers, at least in one of the programs. The program that got the most yeses was Medi-Cal, followed by other services, and then CalFresh after that. So I'll be able to really pull this out and count how many people said yes to each one. For those of you who answered yes, youth have been refused other services. That's kind of that catch-all. If you feel like mentioning in the chat box what those services are, that could be very helpful. Just like I mentioned for schools, for all of these different programs, it's unclear the extent to which they've been told about AB 652. They might not even, have gotten training to know that this exists, and they certainly might not understand the specific challenges of unaccompanied youth and how CPS reporting creates a barrier. So this might be an opportunity to provide some information and some technical assistance to some of these programs. So I really appreciate you providing that information for us. Okay, with that, I am going to take a look at the chat box here. I noticed the very first question I saw was related to the outcomes data on foster youth and how many foster youth that emancipate from care experience homelessness, and asking kind of when that data came from. That data point is actually national data. What I would like to do to respond to the specific question that you asked, because the question was, did that data come after AB 12 or before? Since AB 12 is a state law, it probably wouldn't have any measurable impact on the national data. But I can take a look and see what California data we can find on that. But I do know that the issue of transition age youth and youth aging out of foster care is something that the state has paid a lot of attention to, but still continues to be a challenge, and we still continue to see youth aging out of foster care and experiencing homelessness very shortly thereafter. Some other questions. A question: why would one not report to CPS? Wouldn't it be better if social services got involved? In some cases, it probably is better. There's a slide that we addressed earlier on to show that only 15% of reports to CPS result in a substantiated report and any kind of services, and that's 15% of all reports. That percentage, when you look at teenage youth, is much, much lower. So what we have is a situation where the fear of the reporting is keeping youth away from services and help that they need, whereas the actual fact of the report is very unlikely to result in any services to the youth. So we have this very out of balance perception of, I'm going to call CPS so that this youth can get help, when actually the CPS call more often than not is going to keep the youth from getting help because they're going to be afraid to reveal their situation due to the fear of that barrier, whereas the report itself is very unlikely to result in services for the young person. So that's kind of the tension that AB 652 is looking at and trying to address. I hope that's helpful. Another question, Sky, is a question about charter schools. This is a great question because there's often a lot of questions about how does any of this stuff apply to charter schools. So in terms of charter schools in the McKinney-Vento Act, and I will just refer you to some resources as well. Charter schools do have to comply with all of the McKinney-Vento Act. So if the question is, what do we need to do to be in compliance? It's a lot and probably too much for me to go into right now on this call. In terms of AB 652, a charter school would do the same thing as any other public school, the same thing as a youth services program, the same thing as anyone coming into contact with young people, which is that, again, being unaccompanied and homeless is not grounds for the report to CPS, and you want to use some of the strategies that Amy talked about. For more information on charter schools, the National Center for Homeless Education has a charter school brief that I think just came out. It was in its process of going through the Department of Ed clearance, and I'm not sure if it's gone through the clearance yet, but I feel like it did, and it's available now. And again, that's the National Center for Homeless Education, and you can Google them, and they have a lot of resources. But basically, any of their resources about McKinney-Vento would apply to charter schools as well. Excuse me. A question about any age differentiation in the term youth. So for CPS reporting, of course, it's under 18 because there wouldn't be CPS reporting for anyone 18 or older. So for this particular presentation for AB 652, that's why AB 652 uses the term minor. I've used the term youth because it's just a little bit kind of more friendly, I guess, to folks who aren't lawyers. But we're talking about under 18. Unaccompanied youth under the McKinney-Vento Act has no age range on it whatsoever. So it's really just any youth who is experiencing homelessness and not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. Now, how you approach the youth obviously might be different. So if you think about the strategies that Amy talked about, how you engage those strategies with a 17-year-old might be a little bit different than how you engage them with a 12-year-old. And some of the comments that would trigger a report to CPS would be different, obviously, for a 12-year-old and for a 17-year-old. So I think the interaction is obviously different, but legally speaking, there's not a limit there on the definition of age. Let's see, a question about, someone makes a comment that it seems that people professionals are not aware of all the resources available for homeless families and youth outside of the CPS CFS system. I think that's a great comment. In all the places that I've worked in California around the country, of course, there are never enough resources for homeless youth, but there often is a disconnect in terms of knowledge of what's really out there and what's available. One place that you might want to check out, I mentioned the California Coalition for Youth earlier. They have a hotline, and they have information about resources that are available in every community in the state of California. So I don't actually have their contact information on the slide, but if you just Google California Coalition for Youth, you'll find them. You'll find their hotline number. And so if whatever part of the state you're in, you can give them a call and say, hey, I'm in this community. I really need to find a housing resource or a food resource or a transportation resource or an employment resource, and they should be able to provide you with that information or at least connect you with someone in your community who hopefully can. So thank you for raising that. That's a really important issue. Let me do just maybe 2 more questions, just looking at the time here. I want to make sure that we're respecting everyone's time. So we're going to take a couple more questions, and then we'll show you the contact information that you need to kind of get additional information here. We have a couple of questions here about parent signatures. So someone asked a question about IEPs. Someone else asked a question about continuation schools. So under McKinney-Vento, remember that youth need to be immediately enrolled in school, even if they don't have a parent or guardian